What if the only person standing between you and your last breath is the one everyone else refuses to see? Rain fell over Chicago in beaded chains, draping the alleys in a metallic shimmer that turned every puddle into a broken mirror. Officer Sienna Hart eased her cruiser along Halstead, eyes scanning the back lots behind shuttered bodegas and the brick flank of an old warehouse slated for redevelopment sometime soon, which meant never. Dispatch had pinged a vague disturbance. No caller ID, no clean description, only coordinates and the thin voice of a concerned neighbor. 11 hours into her shift, the world narrowed to training, instincts, and the quiet ache between her shoulders. She parked by a loading dock where a rusted pulley hung like a dead halo and stepped out, letting the rain sting her cheeks awake. At first, the figure at the alley mouth looked like a mistake in the scenery. A hood pulled low, a jacket that used to be a jacket, a beard gone wild with weather. Then Sienna noticed the dog press close to the man's leg, lean and brindled, ears forward, a low rumble in its chest like a motor idling. "Evening," Sienna said, not unkind, her palm hovering inches from the holster but not touching it. The air smelled of wet cardboard, old oil, and last week's oranges left to sour. The man didn't beg. He didn't flinch. He didn't come closer. He lifted his head, and his eyes flashed with something precise. His voice arrived hoarse, like the sound had to claw its way up a throat unused to being heard. "Don't talk," he said quietly. "Just listen." A dozen times before, Sienna had heard slurred warnings on corners like this, panic bubbling into nonsense. This wasn't that. The words came out taut as wire, tuned to urgency but not fear. The dog's rumble deepened, pointed not at her but past her, into the dark seam between dumpsters where the alley narrowed. "Behind you," the man whispered. "He's been waiting." "Watched you drive up," Sienna pivoted slow, shoulders bladed, spine catching the cruiser's cold reassurance. Her light cut a bright lane through the drizzle. Trash cans crowded the wall, water ticking rhythmically off lids. A ladder leaned like an accusation. A pallet slumped against brick. Nothing moved. Still, a muscle she trusted tightened anyway. "Chicago police," she called, voice stern but level. "Step out and show me your hands." Only the rain answered, whispering its soft, indifferent song along the gutters. "Don't shoot," the man said without pleading, as if he had read the next 3 seconds on her face and wanted to preserve them. "He's got a knife." The dark shook itself into motion. A figure unpinned from shadow and lunged, the glint of steel catching and vanishing in a heartbeat. Sienna slid left, muscle memory rehearsed until the body doesn't need permission, and her weapon cleared leather, front sight seeking the space that would not put a hole in someone who had just decided to stand between a blade and a badge. The dog launched, a tight coil unspooling, striking the attacker's thigh with enough force to turn clean velocity into jagged angles. The blade flashed again, slicing rain. Sienna tracked, breath in, finger on the wall before the trigger. The worst shots are the ones you never take or the ones you take too soon. She bought herself a beat. The homeless man moved with the committed economy of someone who had already made peace with the price. One step, then a shoulder through the attacker's center line. Arms locking around the knife hand, bodies colliding with the wet smack of denim, skin, and street. Water blew out in a halo around them, spraying Sienna's boots and the bottom of her vest. "Drop it," Sienna commanded. The attacker thrashed, words dissolving into sound, pulling for leverage. The dog, Rook she would later learn, snapped a precise warning near the wrist, not biting down, not drawing blood, just telling the blade what would happen if it kept misbehaving. Sienna fired once, straight up. The report tore the rain in half. Somewhere, a shade snapped aside. The attacker flinched, and in that reflex, the man found an advantage. He slid his palm over the assailant's knuckles, wrenched the wrist, and sent the knife skittering from fingers, a metallic beetle clattering across concrete. It kissed the toe of Sienna's boot, and she kicked it under the cruiser, never taking her eyes off the fight. "Hands!" she barked, closing the distance. She rode the surge of movement like a wave, pinned an elbow, twisted, and felt the solid surrender of bone-meeting protocol. The cuff's click held the sound of a door closing gently on a room where bad decisions had been living for too long. Sienna's lungs remembered breathing. She holstered, the alley suddenly louder with the wet percussion of rain, Sirens far and near, footsteps approaching. She looked at the man, hair plastered, jacket glistening with water and streetlight, dog pressed to his ribs. His face was angular, hollow at the cheeks, grime scuffed into a map of too many winters. His eyes remained exact. "You could have been killed," Sienna said, the words sitting in her mouth heavier than they sounded. "So could you," he replied, simple as arithmetic. Blue and red strobes began to bounce off the walls, washing their faces in cheap fireworks. Sienna radioed her status in a voice restored to steady by sheer insistence. Two patrol officers jogged into the scene, shoes splashing, eyes flicking from cuffs to knife to man to dog to Sienna. "Who's he?" one asked, the tone wading through curiosity toward something smaller. "The reason I'm standing," Sienna said. "Bag that knife. Start a canvas." She turned back to the man as the attacker got hauled to his feet, bleeding temper and rain. Sienna brought a foil blanket from her trunk, its crinkle loud in the wet. She held it out rather than draping it. He took it and wrapped it around his shoulders with an odd, careful delicacy, as if the act had to be done in a way that wouldn't startle the world. "Do you want medics to look at you?" she asked. "No hospitals," he said, a little too quickly. Shame and practicality tangled in the words. The dog nudged his thigh. He scratched a damp ear and exhaled. "What's your name?" Sienna asked. The question traveled between them like a bird deciding whether to land. "Jonas," he said finally. "Jonas Reed." He angled his chin at the dog. "Rook." "Officer Sienna Hart," she answered, feeling something formal calibrate inside her, like a compass needle settling. "Thank you, Jonas, for the warning, for all of it." "You listened," he said again, and Sienna understood that to him, that might be rarer than everything else. An evidence tech bagged the knife. The arrested man hurled bad sentences at the rain. Neighbors peered through blinds, half faces in rectangles of light. When the alley thinned back to only rain and the hangover quiet of adrenaline wearing off, Sienna handed Jonas 2 shelf-stable meals from her trunk stockpile and a bottle of water. He passed the water to Rook first, tipping it so the dog could lap neatly without coughing, then took a cautious sip himself. "I'm usually under the canal overpass when it gets loud," he offered, as if part of him wanted to spare her the trouble of asking questions. He gave the alley a small, considering look, like you give a chessboard after a surprising move. "You should go. You get sick standing still in weather like this. Will I see you again?" The question escaped before Sienna could corral it. Jonas's mouth tugged into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Probably not," he said, "but I'll see you." He melted into the wet dark with a grace that only practice gives, the blanket flashing once like a fish scale, then gone. In the cruiser's weak heat, Sienna stared at her hands until the tremor left them, then wrote her report in clean lines that left out what could not be measured, that the edge between living and not had sounded like a hoarse whisper saying, "Don't talk," that courage sometimes comes disguised as shabby clothes and a loyal dog, and that tonight the rain seemed to choose sides. She drove patrol until dawn, unstitched the night, and the city yawned itself awake. By the time she turned the cruiser in, her mind had already decided to look for Jonas Reed again. Not because she needed to repay anything, she told herself, because a life that had learned to be invisible had just done the most visible thing of all. And you don't let that vanish back into the alley like it never happened. If a city can swallow a man whole, what would it take to make the city spit him back out? 3 nights later, the rain had scrubbed the sky clean, and the South Loop's bricks glowed like damp embers under street lamps. Sienna rolled beneath the Canal Street overpass at the end of her patrol loop, telling herself this was simply good policing. Know your spaces, know your people. Under the ribs of the bridge, tarps bunched like giant caterpillars asleep in their cocoons, cardboard flattened with a practiced hand into pallets of not quite comfort. Someone had chalked a chessboard on the concrete and left a handful of bottle caps as pieces. He wasn't there that night, or the next. She left a note zipped into a plastic bag and taped to a pillar where the tarps cast a shadow at noon. Short, plain, her initials only. "Thank you again. Stay safe. S.H." On a wind-bitten Thursday, she turned the corner under the viaduct and saw Rook first, the dog lifting his head from the crook of a man's knees, ears swiveling toward the growl of approaching tires. Jonas leaned against a retaining wall, hood up, blanket folded into something like a cushion beneath him. He looked surprised for a heartbeat. Then he didn't. It was a face that had taught itself to be unreadable, because being read wrongly can be dangerous. I was starting to believe the rain made you up, Sienna said, crouching so her voice didn't carry. I thought the same about you, he answered. Rook stood and parked his chin in her palm, tail thumping a shy rhythm. She handed Jonas a paper sack with a sandwich, a protein bar, and bottled water. He accepted it and, without flourish, opened the water for Rook first. He tipped carefully. The dog drank without greed, pausing twice to breathe, as if the act were a ritual with rules. Why did you do it? Sienna asked after the quiet had stretched to comfortable. You stepped in before backup. You didn't know me. Jonas scratched Rook's chest and watched his fingers make neat grooves in damp fur. Because no one else would, he said, and because you didn't look at me like I was the mess in your picture. Sienna sat with that. She built trust enough times to know you don't pry. You offer presence, you keep your promises, and you let someone borrow your steadiness until they can afford their own. She learned small details before she learned big ones. Jonas called the churches by the days they served hot food. He could identify the week's trash routes by the smell alone. He knew which convenience store clerks would let him warm his hands and which would rap on the glass, even when the store was empty. He'd found Rook behind a warehouse one February, ribs like a washboard and eyes too big for his head, and had fed him half a stale muffin in all his warmth. She also learned that Jonas listened like a craftsman, to footsteps, to the rhythm of a crowd, to the way people put their weight on joints. He named old injuries and strangers by the bias in their stride. A man who should have been numb wasn't. It made Sienna wonder what he used to be before the city put him on a shelf labeled ignore. The city noticed them too. A patrol from another district slowed and stared long enough to make the night feel 10 degrees colder. A young officer made a sideways joke that died when Sienna turned her face toward him and didn't blink. Respect isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just refusing to participate in a small cruelty. The next week, the radio bled urgent. Missing child, 7-year-old male, last seen at park number 540 near the river, wearing a yellow hoodie with a cartoon tiger. Sienna's spine went electric. She gunned it north, siren cutting clean lanes through traffic. The park looked the way terror makes every place look. Parents running in useless circles, officers fanning through bushes, volunteers shouting names into the kind of silence that hurts. Rook can track, Jonas said, appearing at her side like a fact you almost forgot. He didn't ask if he should be there. He held out a hand to the mother, and when she pressed a small tiger-faced mitten into his palm, he lowered it to Rook's nose. The dog inhaled, froze, then pulled hard enough to make Jonas jog to keep up. They didn't go toward the playground or the restrooms, both already torn apart by anxious hands. They cut diagonally across the grass, into a thicket, and stopped before a maintenance shed Sienna had clocked and dismissed because the padlock looked new. Mud smeared the threshold. Her mouth went dry. "Chicago police," she shouted. "If you're in there, speak now." No reply. Either empty or someone smarter than she hoped. Bolt cutters bit. The lock fell. Inside, a little boy with a tiger on his chest blinked up, face blotchy with crying, voice hoarse with all the words he'd used up. He launched toward the first human, who didn't feel like a wall. Rook sat instantly, tail sweeping a soft arc, head low as if the boy were made of sugar and glass. The mother's scream became a sob that turned into a laugh and then back into a sob, layering sound on sound until everyone around them had to close their eyes for a second. Sienna stepped aside and let the reunion land. When her sergeant hustled over, saw Jonas, saw Rook, saw the boy, a question loaded itself into his mouth. Who? The reason this kid goes home tonight, Sienna said. She didn't raise her voice. She arranged it carefully and set it on the ground between them. Word traveled. It always does in the gummy way street stories travel, by rumor and repetition. Jonas hated the attention and tried to vanish, which only made Sienna more determined to formalize his presence before someone more cynical exploited it. She brought it to Captain Marcel Ruiz, a man who wore the job and the lines around his eyes. He saved me in an alley, she said. He tracked a missing kid when minutes mattered. He speaks Spanish and Polish at least, maybe more. We need him. And he needs us. Ruiz leaned back, steepling fingers in a way that belonged in an older cop movie. What do you want me to do, Hart? Badge a man without an address? No, Sienna said. Hire a civilian liaison on a part-time basis. Someone who can translate, de-escalate, and see what we miss because the job has taught us to look past it. Ruiz stared at her long enough that she began to feel the outline of a lecture. Bring him in, he said finally. No promises. He paused. No pity either. The fluorescent buzz of the precinct framed Jonas like a bad omen when he walked in with Rook and too many eyes crawled over him. He stood in the lobby clutching a fraying leash in the dignity he'd saved for occasions like this. Sienna flanked him, an unspoken declaration of sponsorship. The trial was nothing cinematic. It was a Tuesday afternoon with too many forms. It was a scared woman from Oaxaca who relaxed when Jonas's Spanish came out gentle and precise, turning a tangle of fear into a linear narrative an officer could write. It was a Polish grandfather who went from belligerent to tearful in a minute because someone finally understood the word he'd been failing to pronounce over his dentures. It was a teenager in a hoodie who calmed when Jonas said, in the kid's own slang, "Breathe, man. No one's trying to make you into something you're not. Tell the truth and we'll walk by evening." Ruiz had seen enough to sign a temporary contract. The pay would not make a life. The schedule would not fix the past. But under a thin line of letters spelling out community liaison, Jonas's name appeared. Rook acquired a water bowl and 3 donors of snacks overnight. Officers who had watched him like he was a problem began to nod with a shame-faced respect, born from being proven wrong in public. It wasn't clean. Nothing about it was. Paperwork snarled around background checks that insisted on addresses and dates Jonas couldn't produce without ripping open the kind of memory that smells like bleach and plastic mattresses. He had nights when the station's lights felt like interrogation rather than welcome, when the press of bodies and their layered perfumes made the room tilt. He slipped into the dark then, back to the canal, to the only ceiling that never fell on him. Sienna found him under the ribs of the overpass, sat beside him on cold concrete, and let silence form a roof. "You don't owe me this," he muttered once as she cleaned a shallow cut above his brow, from a tangle with boys who wanted Rook more than they wanted to fight. "You didn't owe me an alley," she said. "But here we are." Trust made a home in their routine. Sienna would clock off and stop by the tiny community center where Jonas now helped triage people to city services that rarely had room for them. He translated, listened, taught a class of kids how to read the street's tells without becoming its victim. Rook became a legend, his picture taped to a bulletin board with captions in 3 languages, reminding children that gentle doesn't mean weak. Under all the good, something darker pulsed. Jonas had started to notice patterns most people, most cops, missed. A particular spray-painted symbol, 3 nested triangles, in alleys around decommissioned warehouses. A box truck appearing near midnight twice a week, always with a logistics sticker glued at a slant. Always departing west on the same ramp. Snatches of conversation in Polish and Spanish, words that slotted together like puzzle pieces if you'd learned to keep your mouth shut and your ears open. It felt like a heartbeat under the city's floorboards. He told Sienna carefully, testing whether the ground between them could hold conspiracy. "I think there's a pipeline moving, kid," he said, eyes on Rook's collar because eye contact made hard things harder. "Runaways. The kind no one misses fast. They're using old buildings like Avery and Sons as waypoints. It's small scale, smart enough to stay under your numbers." Sienna's stomach turned over, not because she doubted him, but because she didn't. "I'll take it up." Quietly, she said, "You did right bringing it to me, but it has to run clean. If we spook them, they'll fold the tent." Jonas nodded. He looked like a man who had tried to report things before and learned exactly how quickly the world can polish its boots on the truth. "Do what you have to," he said. "I'll keep listening." She typed the memo 3 times until the words sat straight and sober enough to withstand scrutiny. Ruiz approved a soft probe. Vice owed him 2 favors. They blanketed 3 properties with eyes that didn't blink and ears that didn't draw attention. The first week turned up nothing except rats and water damage. Then a Monday fell open. A white box truck arrived at Avery and Sons at 2:13 a.m. idled for 7 minutes, then rolled out. No pallets clicked, no loading dock whined, nothing. But a camera on a city bus yard caught the side panel leveling into a door under the dock platform like a magician's slide. A handset hung in the air useless. By the time Sienna and two detectives slid around the block, the dock swallowed its own evidence. They found a single shoelace caught on a splinter of wood, small and pink and impossible to explain away. By sunup, 3 men were in custody. One had bailed over the fence and fled into the maze of a neighborhood that had learned to keep secrets, and the white truck's insides had given up enough evidence to build a case with ankles and knees as well as feet. The shoelace from last week found its story in a series of texts, time stops, and a burner number that connected to a bitter little web. The van's plates belonged to a dead car on the other side of the city. The dock had been modified by somebody who knew hydraulics better than they knew conscience. The press got it before noon. A civilian consultant had helped officers intercept a trafficking route. The word hero did what it always does. Meant well, complicated everything, and glued embarrassment to those who had dismissed Jonas a month earlier. Cameras grew like mushrooms around precinct steps. Ruiz gave quotes fit for public consumption. Maureen scowled at microphones until they went away. Sienna retreated into paperwork because she understood the way grief and relief marry in a report. Jonas wanted to disappear. Fame was not a coat that fit him. The station tried to make him stand on a dais for a photo with people in suits. He showed up because Sienna asked, but he stood slightly behind her, beside Rook, one hand in the dog's ruff, as if steadiness could be absorbed through fur. When it was his turn to speak, he cleared his throat, which sounded like gravel moving. "I'm not a hero," he said, looking at no one and everyone. "I'm a man who was given a second chance to be useful. Please don't use me to stop seeing the other people out there who don't have my luck. They matter even when you're not pointing a camera at them." The room made that sound rooms make when someone has given them a better version of themselves. Applause rose, messy and sincere. Sienna felt her throat close, not with tears, but with a warmth she had been hungry for since the job had tried to make her iron. The victory, because it was one, brought company. Internal Affairs opened a gate and asked its usual cold questions. The nature of Sienna's relationship with a civilian, any benefits, any corners cut, any policy bent until ethics made a new shape. She answered plainly, eyes steady, Will refusing to apologize for refusing to be blind. Ruiz stood behind her without touching the process, and somehow that helped. The memo trail was clean. The use of a civilian liaison met policy. Jonas's hiring had paperwork. The alley was the alley. IA closed its folder mostly satisfied and a little disappointed it had not found a ghost to prosecute. Change is not a trumpet. It's a series of small budgets approved and a series of smaller hearts permitting themselves to adjust. The precinct made Jonas's position permanent at a number that would cover a studio apartment if the studio didn't mind cracked tile and the smell of cabbage from the neighbors. A caseworker with a spine and a laugh found him a spot in a building where the property manager did not look at him like a problem. The day Jonas held a key and turned it in a lock that answered to him, he stood in the doorway and forgot how to enter. Rook bounded past, circled twice, and claimed a corner with the joy of a creature who understands home without needing it explained. The place was small enough to talk across without raising your voice. The heat worked. The windows stuck on humid days. The sunlight made a square on the floor at 3 in the afternoon that looked like a stage. Sienna brought a thrift store lamp, a set of plates that almost matched, and a plant she promised could not die even if you tried to kill it. Jonas bought flowers with his first paycheck and looked as startled as a teenager handing over a prom corsage when he set them on Sienna's counter before a dinner she cooked more nervously than any booking she'd ever done. They talked. Not about case law, not about the city's thousand hungers, about books half remembered from a time when Jonas had believed in semesters, about the way Rook had learned to open doors with his paw, about Sienna's mother and Joliet, who wanted her to quit because she knew too many funerals by first names. They learned to laugh without apologizing for it. They learned to let silences stretch without assuming they were broken. Jonas still left some nights when the room got loud and the walls leaned in. He walked the old paths not because he missed the cold, but because he wanted to understand the version of himself that had survived it. Sienna didn't try to fix it. She sat beside him on a curb or under the viaduct and practiced the art he had taught her first. Listening. The city did not stop being itself. Another call. Another mother whose voice had run out of adjectives for fear. Another kid on a corner trying on a future that didn't fit. But the city had to make room for a new equation now, one that included a man it had almost erased. Months later, a ceremony in a municipal building with bad acoustics tried to thread the needle between celebration and appropriation. A plaque changed hands. Ruiz shook Jonas's hand longer than necessary. Moraine clapped Rook's flank and pretended someone had put dust in his eye. The mayor said words that sounded like they had lived in a drawer. Sienna stood in the back and let the noise roll over her. Jonas spoke when prompted with the economy of someone who wastes nothing. Afterward, the street took them back. They walked in a light rain that felt like a memory polishing itself. Rook trotted between them, leash slack, body language content, traffic side. Somewhere, a saxophone played with the windows open. "Do you ever think about tomorrow?" Sienna asked, not coy, not testing, just curious about the way the word fit in his mouth now. Jonas looked at the dog, at the city that had learned his name, and at Sienna with a soft amazement that didn't embarrass him. "I didn't," he said. "For a long time." He let the breath go. "Now I do. I don't know what it looks like, but I know I'll be there for it." They reached the corner where the alley that had almost killed one life and started another opened its wet mouth to the street. The brick was the same. The palette leaned. A new sticker, 3 nested triangles crossed out in black marker, peeled slowly on a utility pole. An old language speaking in a new voice. "Not here." Sienna touched the sticker with 2 fingers, like a benediction. "You caught something shocking that night," she said, smiling a little. "Not just a man with a knife." "What then?" Jonas asked, enjoying the game of it. "Me," she said. "You caught me." Before I fell into the kind of officer I promised I'd never become. The kind who forgets which people count. Jonas absorbed that with the same quiet that made hard truths easier. "Fair trade in," he said. "You caught me too." They didn't kiss there because some moments deserve privacy and some stories earn their endings in rooms with lamps that almost match. They walked on, not away from the alley but through it, as if to teach the memory a new trick. The rain listened. The city, which rarely learns anything, learned this. A man it had taught itself to ignore had stepped into the worst part of the night twice and carried light out with him both times. Back at the apartment, Jonas unlocked his own door and held it for Sienna and Rook. The plant on the sill looked improbably alive. On the counter sat the envelope with his first permanent paycheck, creased from being opened and closed like a prayer. He had work in the morning, and a key he could lose, and a window that stuck, and a friend who refused to let him become invisible again. "Hungry?" Sienna asked. "Always," Jonas said. He smiled, which he was getting better at. "That's one of the things about living." Rook thumped his tail like a drum line in a parade that had finally reached its street. Outside, the city's sirens drew lines between emergencies he could feel in his bones and the ordinary heartbeat of traffic. Inside, 2 people and a dog arranged themselves around a table and put down roots so quietly the building didn't know to object. If anyone asked later what it sounded like when the future began, Sienna would say it was the click of a deadbolt sliding home, and a voice that had once rasped, "Don't talk," now saying without fear, "Tell me everything."